BBC 5 Live.
5 Live Drive with Anna Foster and Tony Livesey.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Drive, then. After more than a decade of deadlock and 2 years of intense negotiations, 6 world powers declared this morning that they'd reached a deal over Iran's nuclear programme.
Iran will dismantle much of its nuclear infrastructure in return for the lifting of economic sanctions on the country, in a deal designed to stop the spread of atomic weapons and avoid a major new conflict in the Middle East. I've
been speaking to BBC Persian special correspondent Kazra Naji. He told me more about the agreement.
The basic deal is that the international community has committed itself to lifting sanctions against Iran for Iran to drastically reduce its nuclear activities, basically closing all pathways for Iran achieving or getting its hands on a nuclear weapon. Basically means no nuclear weapon, no war, basically, and it's a good deal for all concerned.
Critics are already saying it's a better deal for Iran than the international community, and you would expect Israel to be critical, but Benjamin Netanyahu says hundreds of billions of dollars will now go to fuel a terror machine and its expansion and aggression throughout the Middle East and across the globe.
Well, I don't know about that, but I know that as part of lifting of the sanctions, there's going to be some $120 billion worth of Iranian assets that have been frozen in banks in Far Eastern countries where Iran has been exporting oil. That money is going to be released. That's quite a bit of money, but don't forget that if Iran was going to be active in the region in the way that Mr. Netanyahu is suggesting, and maybe it has, the fact is the fact that it doesn't have access to this money hasn't stopped Iran doing what it does. So I'm not sure whether this bit of money, this amount of money, is going to make that much difference to the general strategy of Iran in the region and beyond.
Well, President Obama spoke to the world's media from the White House early this morning to say the deal had removed the threat of nuclear war in the region for the next 15 years.
Today, because America negotiated from a position of strength and principle, we have stopped the spread of nuclear weapons in this region. Because of this deal, the international community will be able to verify that the Islamic Republic of Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon. This deal meets every single one of the bottom lines that we established when we achieved a framework earlier this spring. Every pathway to a nuclear weapon is cut off, and the inspection and transparency regime necessary to verify that objective will be put in place.
Well, the deal still has to be approved by lawmakers in the United States, and there's plenty of opposition to it. But President Obama had strong words for members of Congress, warning them against trying to block the deal.
I am confident that this deal will meet the national security interests of the United States and our allies. So I will veto any legislation that prevents the successful implementation of this deal. We do not have to accept an inevitable spiral into conflict, and we certainly shouldn't seek it. And precisely because the stakes are so high, this is not the time for politics or posturing. Tough talk from Washington does not solve problems.
Well, let's speak to Shane Harris, senior correspondent for the Daily Beast, a news and politics website based in Washington. Shane, hello, welcome to the programme.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So President Obama up at 7 a.m. Washington time this morning. He obviously feels the deal is hugely significant, but there are those who say he's so determined to get this legacy, if you will, for his presidency that he's compromised the negotiations and he's given too much away.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the main thrust of the criticism against this deal is that, you know, this is the first time, the critics will say, that we've negotiated with a proliferating state over the future of their nuclear program. So why did we even negotiate over enrichment levels and how many centrifuges they could have? I think there are people who see this from the beginning as essentially a negotiation whose outcome was not to completely prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but to forestall that, which, of course, is not how the president framed it, but that is how his critics are seeing it today.
Yeah, in fact, people are saying, look, in 15 years' time, they may well have nuclear weapons, and that is precisely the point that Israel are making. And that is really this. I mean, it's one thing to talk about Congress and their reaction, and we heard what President Obama said he'll do in that case. But with Israel, it's completely different, isn't it? Because they attacked a nuclear reactor in Iraq back in 1981, and they've certainly not ruled out similar action in the future.
Oh, that's absolutely right. I mean, they've been very clear about this, that the military action would be on the table. And even President Obama this morning saying, look, this is a best way to forestall that, doesn't preclude Israel from taking matters into its own hands. And I think that you will see a pretty heavy lobbying effort by Israeli officials to try and persuade members of Congress in the United States to vote against this deal, which they're going to have a chance to sort of give it a thumbs up or thumbs down, which is largely symbolic, but it could be a big political blow to the president if they were to vote no on it. But really very strong words of opposition coming out of Israel this morning, which was not expected given how steadfastly they've been against this deal for a long time.
Yeah, just to put that in context for people listening, an Israeli minister, Danny Danon, said giving the world's largest supporter of terrorism a free pass in developing nuclear weapons is like providing a pyromaniac with matches.
Right, and he's going to find that there's a lot of people in the U.S. Congress, I think, who feel the same way, and for precisely those reasons, that this is, after all, this is a huge state supporter of terrorism. Nobody disputes that in a country with a pretty ugly human rights record. And President Obama has really tried to compartmentalize that as much as possible and say, look, this is just about the future of the nuclear program, and even the sanctions relief that the U.S. is proposing to go along with is just on those people who've been sanctioned for their involvement in the nuclear program, not for support of terrorism, et cetera, although those things are kind of intertwined in Iran. But yeah, it would be a mischaracterization to call this a wildly popular deal in Washington.
Yeah. So if we look at the realpolitik aspect here, Shane, and when we hear President Obama say the world's a safer and more secure place, do we interpret it as the world is a safer and more secure place for at least the next 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, because, I mean, who can really say beyond 15 years what the Iranians might do under a completely different leadership or a different regime? I mean, it is the case, if you look at this document, this agreement, it's a highly technical agreement. There are lots and lots of places where there will be inspections, and if the Iranians resist that, there are measures that can be taken to put sanctions back on them. So it's not as if this is a carte blanche for Iran, but it really does only pertain to this sort of, finite period. And while the Iranians are committing, at least in principle, not to seek a nuclear weapon, I mean, a lot can change in 15 years. And so I think, this is going to clearly be something that a future president is going to have to deal with, because I don't think Iran has curtailed its ambitions, certainly to be a regional superpower. And you have to wonder whether or not it will still look for ways to pursue this program down the road.
Yeah. And another issue that the observers are saying has compromised the negotiations as far as the international coalition is concerned is the desire by Russia and China to start selling weapons again to Iran. And the arms embargo, this was a late addition to the agreement, I believe, but the arms embargo will be lifted in 5 years' time.
That's right, and it was and remains a huge issue of contention in the United States. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military officer, came out publicly a few days back and said it would be a huge mistake to lift this arms embargo that would allow Iran to start acquiring sophisticated weapons, and of course the Russians would love to sell them to them. And so the kind of compromise, if you like, is that they'll be allowed that the UN embargo would lift in 5 years. Well, that may placate some members of Congress and some in the U.S. military who say, okay, that's down the road a bit, but you're still talking about ultimately lifting an embargo. And I think that's going to be a big sticking point for the president as he tries to persuade lawmakers, including in his own party, that this is ultimately a good deal to sign on to.
Shane, final question. As you've said, there's huge detail here that'll be poured over the next few days and weeks. But just looking at the wider picture, the context of relations between America and Iran, of course, go back to 1979 and the hostage situation in Iran. It's fair to say, I think, that relationships have been hostile ever since. Is this a thawing now? Is this a sign that at some stage Iran and America can maybe, work together to fight ISIS, for example?
Well, they are kind of a little bit working together to do that right now. That's a bit tenuous. But I wouldn't read this as a broader thaw, and I don't think that the White House and other officials who I've spoken to who are involved in negotiations quite portray it that way either. I mean, there are still 4 Americans who are being held in Iran, one of whom has been missing for many, many years. They're holding an American journalist who writes for the Washington Post. I think that the administration has tried to kind of, again, carve this out and compartmentalize it as one set of issues, though a big issue. But we'll see. I guess it's a hope springs eternal kind of thing, but I'm not reading in the immediate sort of aftermath of this passage any kind of new thawing in Iranian-U.S. relations.
OK, Shane, thanks very much indeed. That's Shane Harris there from the Daily Beast in Washington, 6:15.
This is 5 Live Drive.
And the headline, sanctions against Iran will be lifted after Tehran agreed to restrict its nuclear programme.
Sounds of celebrations in Tehran tonight. There's no way of knowing if this was a spontaneous reaction to the agreement declared in Vienna early today or a demonstration organised to reflect the official Iranian view. Earlier, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the country's supreme leader, visited the president and his cabinet. After previous suggestions of division between them over the negotiations, this was a very deliberate signal. The president, Hassan Rouhani, said Iran should be taken at its word.
Of course, we are committed to the agreement. Over the course of history, whenever the Iranian nation has made a promise or an agreement, it has stuck to its agreement. And we will adhere to this deal on condition that the other party also sticks to its commitment.
9 years of on-off talks and negotiations with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany over the Iranian nuclear programme has resulted in an agreement. The parties don't necessarily agree on what it means. President Obama, for example, says this is not based on trust but on verification. He says the agreement provides for nuclear inspectors to have access anytime, anywhere. Iran's lead negotiator, Mohammad Zarif, the foreign minister, told the BBC it does not. Speaking from the White House, Mr. Obama maintained Iran would not be able to develop nuclear weapons.
Today, because America negotiated from a position of strength and principle, we have stopped the spread of nuclear weapons in this region. Because of this deal, the international community will be able to verify that the Islamic Republic of Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon. This deal meets every single one of the bottom lines that we established when we achieved a framework earlier this spring. Every pathway to a nuclear weapon is cut off, and the inspection and transparency regime necessary to verify that objective will be put in place.
President Obama speaking a little earlier. Well, joining us now from Washington is Congressman Mike Turner, a Republican. He's a member of both the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees in the US House of Representatives. Congressman, good evening.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for being with us. You heard the President there. Every pathway to a nuclear weapon is cut off. Do you accept that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, you have to also start with the perspective that the President of the United States has committed himself to really a non-constitutional process here. As you know, under our Constitution, an actual treaty between two nations requires that be submitted to our Senate for ratification and receive a 2/3 vote of approval. The President would be unable to obtain that with not having the sufficient vote in the Senate. He's bypassing that, not even submitting the deal. But when you go to the substance of the deal, more troubling is the President's statement of that this isn't based on trust but verification. And even in that statement, we would disagree. I know I've met with the representatives from the IAEA, the lead inspector from the Iranian task force, and he said that he'll be given a ledger of which he will be asked to certify both the custody and control of what's on the ledger. But the IAEA has not been asked to certify the ledger. And as the deal clearly states, the inspectors will not have access to any place, any time. There are very, very difficult bureaucratic and long timetable processes for them to request access to other sites, and military sites would be prohibited.
Just on the question of getting this agreement through the Congress, the White House says that after a couple of days to allow for the documents to be brought together, they will be presented to Congress. Congress will have 60 days to consider them. And tonight, the leader of the Republican majority in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, has said it would be hard to override a presidential veto if Congress tries to reject the nuclear deal and the president vetoes Congress over that move. Taking all of those things together, you don't really have any options, do you, but to accept that this is going to happen?
Well, certainly I think the president is headstrong in that he is going to proceed into the implementation of the deal. And as you are aware, since the president is not going through the treaty ratification process, what he's really discussing is the issue of the lifting of sanctions on Iran and how that process goes forward. I think he'll find he has very minimal support in Congress. If he has to go to the issue of vetoing it and then looking to whether or not there's 2/3 of objection, it's going to be very, very close. That certainly there are a very strong majority of Congress who sees through what the president says and that this is not good for the U.S. national security. It's certainly not good for the Middle East. It could result in a arms race there, and I certainly don't think it's good for our allies.
Do you believe that this will prompt Saudi Arabia, an important U.S. ally, to begin examining whether it needs nuclear arsenal of its own?
Well, I think that it's certainly possible that as you go throughout the Middle East, people will look at this deal as ensuring an outcome of a nuclear Iran. I mean, as you know, in your own broadcast, you began this with an Iranian statement that we abide by agreements so long as the other side does. Well, we wouldn't even be in this situation if they were abiding by the NPT agreement, of which they're a signatory, and they have not complied. So
that's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Correct. And so, even at this point, they're a nation that is breaching an international agreement while they say that they're going to comply with the next.
But in truth, what is the alternative if it's not the agreement? Is it simply to bomb their facilities? Is that a realistic alternative?
I think the alternative was to enter the negotiations with very hard principles as to what would be acceptable and not acceptable. And the number one of those should be a significant change in Iran in its international stance. Iran is one of the largest supporters of international terrorism. It's a destabilizing force throughout the Middle East. During this process, there were routine chants by the leadership in Iran of death to America. They are a stated nation who seeks the destruction of Israel. Certainly, in order to believe that they've come to the table in a meaningful way and abandoned their pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, you would expect some changes there.
Well, Congressman Mike Turner, thank you very much for joining us from Washington with your view there this evening. And apologies for you listening at home for the technical quality of that line. But I think you will be very clear about what the Congressman's position is on this deal. But what about the reaction in Tehran? Sassen Behzadi is managing director of a digital agency there.
Well, it's been mostly positive, at least for the people that I've been talking to, mostly business people and friends and family.
What is it about this agreement that matters to Iranians?
I think sanctions relief, if you've lived under sanctions, as we have for the past few years, just the thought of having to be able to work with the rest of the world and hope that your economy improves, it's a big plus. Now, for some of us that are actually in business as well, there are other opportunities as well. But I think sanctions relief is probably the cornerstone and the reason why most people are very happy.
What has the impact of sanctions been on day-to-day life?
I think it's been mostly on prices. Things have become very expensive, hard to get. Everything is available because everything gets smuggled in. Iranians still have lots of money to spend. But, you wake up one day and everything is 4 or 5 times more expensive, but you're making as much money as you did the day before. And you go on living like that for years, it becomes very difficult. So everyday objects and things you're used to paying for becoming very expensive. Now, further than that, things like business deals and stuff becoming almost impossible to do. That adds to it as well.
Is it fair to say that for many Iranians, that side of it is more important than the nuclear side?
Certainly, because they feel that more. I mean, obviously, there's always, pride in being able to have things that very few countries have in terms of technology. But, what people feel every day is more important. And I think that part of it is more important for most Iranians.
You talk about pride. What then about this idea that inspectors for the International Atomic Energy Agency will be able to kind of turn up and inspect, it is suggested, at least by the American Americans without notice, wherever they want, whenever they want, Iran's nuclear facilities. Is there a risk that will cause anger, offence, a sense of sovereignty being compromised?
If you paint it as this dark force being able to sort of go anywhere, anytime, as some conservatives here in Iran do, then that certainly becomes problematic. I mean, most of us would feel that, we've given up too much in our sovereignty. But you can also paint it some other way. I mean, if you say, look, we don't have anything to hide, and to become part of the world community, you have to give up some things like that, and it's not overdone, then I don't think it would be a big deal. So it really depends on how you look at it. There are a lot of people here who have that dark view of it, and they push for the rest of us to view it that way. But most of us view it as a positive thing. There's things you give up to gain other things, to gain trust.
You run a digital agency in Tehran. Let's talk about the business opportunities that might come as a result of this agreement. What are you expecting? What are you hoping will come out of it? What opportunities will be there that perhaps have not been there in the recent past?
My Iranian clients have been reluctant to spend a lot of money, some of it because they didn't have the money. The other part of it has been just waiting and see what happens to this agreement. So I'm hoping that there's certainly going to be some psychological impact and immediate impact where companies would feel more comfortable going forward and doing more work with us. So in terms of Iran itself, I'm hoping that most of my clients will start spending more money. Now, of course, the other big opportunity is that we are a digital agency, and we hope that international companies come back to Iran, and most of them believe in advertising and entering the market through digital media. So we would hopefully have them as well. So it'll be a win on both ends, both on my Iranian clients and international clients that hopefully would begin to trickle back in the next few months, and we would hopefully be able to work with them.
Samson Bezadi.